Clara was once an ordinary girl from the town of Hollow Bluff, until the fears of the adults turned her into a scapegoat. When illness spread and children began to fall sick, they needed someone to blame. The whispers came first, then accusations, and finally violence. They called her cursed, said she spoke to demons, claimed she was a threat that had to be eliminated. On a bitterly cold evening, Clara was dragged before a crowd. Her wrists were bound until they bled, prayers echoing around her like a sentence already passed. Even the one person who should have protected her, her own father, a pastor, stood there in silence, or worse, in agreement. He believed her death was a necessary purification. They cast Clara out of the town in the middle of a snowstorm, stripping her of food, fire, and hope. Behind her, her old home burned to the ground, and Hollow Bluff faded into a pale blur in the white night. Left alone in the biting cold, Clara understood that this was more than punishment. She had been erased. When her legs could no longer hold her, she collapsed beside a frozen stream. The last match flickered out in her trembling fingers. In that moment, Clara did not pray for a miracle. She whispered only a simple wish. She did not want to die here. The cold devoured Clara with every breath she took. When she collapsed beside the frozen stream, the world dissolved into nothing but white and a numb, crushing exhaustion. She no longer had the strength to be afraid, nor the clarity to run. Through the swirling snow, figures on horseback emerged, like the final hallucination before death. They were Apache warriors. Their faces were painted, fur-lined coats wrapped around them, eyes sharp as mountain wind. The terrifying stories about native warriors that Hollow Bluff used to tell came rushing back to Clara's mind, but her body no longer responded. She sank into the snow, her cheek pressed against the ice, waiting for the inevitable. But what happened was nothing like the stories she had heard. There were no screams, no blades coming down. Instead, there was sudden warmth, a heavy blanket draped over her shoulders, strong hands lifting her from the frozen ground. Her weak resistance faded as exhaustion pulled her into darkness. When Clara awoke, she was no longer surrounded by endless white. She lay inside a hide-covered lodge, beside a steady fire, warmth slowly seeping back into her frozen limbs. She was alive, and for the first time in days, death had stepped back just far enough to open the door to another path. When Clara fully came to, the first thing she felt was not fear, but warmth. The fire inside the lodge burned low yet steady, pushing back the cold that had clung to her for days. Beneath her were soft animal hides. Over her shoulders lay a thick blanket that still carried the scent of smoke and dried grass. Her body ached, but she knew she was being cared for. An elderly woman sat beside her. Her hair was neatly braided, her face marked by time, yet her eyes were calm and gentle. She did not press Clara with questions or suspicion. Instead, she quietly handed her a bowl of hot broth. "Drink," she said, in heavily accented but kind English. The heat burned Clara's throat, then spread through her stomach like a small flame, stirring the life that had nearly faded. With a trembling voice, Clara asked why they hadn't left her to die in the snow. The woman met her gaze and answered firmly. She was not born to die that way. There were no promises, no demands in return, just a simple truth. Outside the lodge, the Apache camp hummed with the sounds of life. Children laughing, people tending fires, horses snorting in the early mist. Clara realized that what unsettled her most was not the unfamiliar place, but this quiet kindness, something her former home had never once given her. The tall man entered the lodge in silence, as if he had always been there, simply waiting for Clara to be awake enough to notice him. His gaze was deep and heavy, not threatening, but not easily shaken either. His name was Nantan. He asked no long questions. He only observed, as though reading a story carved into every bruise and each shallow breath she took. Clara told him she had been cast out because she was believed to be cursed. Nantan listened without interrupting. When she admitted that people thought she spoke with demons, he showed no fear. Instead, he replied calmly that demons or spirits are sometimes wiser than humans. The words left Clara stunned. For the first time, her fear was not treated as proof of guilt. Nantan told her that people did not hate her for what she was, but for what they feared. In his tribe, there was a word for those who stood between boundaries, belonging fully to neither world. Silta, not a curse, but a different way of existing. When Nantan led Clara up a hillside overlooking the vast valley below, he told her this place could be her home, if she chose. Not as someone hidden away, but as someone who had survived. In that moment, Clara understood that she did not need forgiveness, only to be seen as a human being still standing after everything she had endured. The fragile peace in the Apache camp did not last. One morning, the pounding of hooves echoed from the edge of the valley, carrying grim news. Scouts reported armed riders approaching the border, white settlers moving in the familiar formation of violence and seizure. Clara did not need to hear the rest. She understood at once. They had come for her, or for whatever they chose to label a threat. The air in the camp shifted. Quiet trust hardened into alert tension. The elders gathered, their expressions grave. Some suggested hiding Clara, sparing the camp from becoming a pretext for bloodshed. But Nantan refused. He knew that hiding would only turn her into prey and feed the invaders' fear. Clara stood within the circle, listening to every word, guilt rising in her chest. She did not want anyone to die because of her. But the truth was harsher. Those men did not need a real reason. They came to burn, to take land, and to assert power through gunfire and flame. Nantan spoke plainly. If they came looking, let them see Clara standing. No running, no bowing. When the decision was made, the Apache camp began to prepare quietly, efficiently, like a storm gathering strength. And Clara understood that the past had found her again, this time not to end her story, but to be faced. Instead of fleeing or bowing her head, Clara chose to stay. As the Apache camp moved into readiness, she was no longer a passive figure to be protected. For the first time, Clara understood that if she wanted to survive, she would have to stand for herself. The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her every move. Nantan handed Clara a bow, without promises or encouragement. "Try," he said simply. At first, her hands trembled, the arrow veering off and falling silently into the sand. But her breathing slowed. Each draw of the string grew steadier. She missed far more than she hit, yet every strike on the target marked a step beyond her former self. White Fawn placed a small knife in Clara's handbone handle, cold black stone blade. She told her that no one could protect Clara's story for her. If it came to it, Clara would have to speak that truth herself, even in blood. There was no cruelty in the words, only the stark reality of this world. Clara did not call herself a warrior. She only wanted to be ready. Ready to stand when her name was spoken. Ready not to fall when the past returned with fire and guns. That night, she sat by the fire, the bow resting across her knees, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. She was no longer the girl kneeling in the snow. She was learning how to exist as a warning. Before dawn could rise, the Apache camp was already in motion, silent, tightly wound. Children were led to safety, campfires extinguished, every trace of life carefully erased. Warriors spread out along rocky slopes and narrow ravines, blending into the terrain like shadows. Nothing was done to display strength. Everything was done to survive. From a high vantage point, Clara could see the entire valley. Camouflage traps, deliberate decoys left just visible enough to be tempting, all designed to draw the enemy into error. She recognized the tactic immediately. It was the same way her old town had surrounded her home, setting fire from behind instead of facing her directly. When she said so, the men listened and nodded in quiet agreement. Soon, dust rose from the narrow trail. White riders appeared, armed with rifles and torches, advancing with undisguised aggression. They charged straight into the trap that had been laid. The first arrow cut through the air, followed by a scream. Horses panicked, flames caught in the brush, smoke choking the ravines. Gunshots thundered off the canyon walls, mixing with the clash of metal and stone. The fight erupted, violent yet controlled. No shouting, no mercy. From above, Clara gripped her bow, her heart pounding, but her eyes never leaving the battlefield. She understood that in this moment, every boundary had burned away, and there was no retreat left for anyone. Amid the smoke and chaos, one man broke away from the line of riders and moved forward. Clara recognized him instantly, her father, Pastor Caleb Monroe. His familiar black coat whipped in the wind, a rifle resting across his saddle like a symbol of the authority that had once weighed so heavily on her childhood. When he called out, the battlefield seemed to falter, as if both sides were holding their breath. He raised a white cloth and declared that he had come to claim his daughter. His voice echoed through the canyon, still carrying the same preaching tone Clara had once feared. All eyes turned to her. In that moment, Clara stepped out from her hiding place and stood tall on the rocky slope. No shouting, no trembling. She spoke clearly, saying that she did not belong to him. Not in anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who had survived. Her father's face twisted with rage. He lifted his rifle, convinced that violence could still force her back. Two movements happened almost at once. A gunshot rang out and Clara's arrow flew. His bullet missed. Her arrow knocked the rifle from his hands, tearing away the last symbol of his power. As the fighting surged on around them, Clara understood that she had severed the deepest bond of all, not through death, but through a refusal that could never be undone. When the gunfire finally faded, the valley was left with smoke, the stench of powder, and a heavy silence. The surviving settlers scattered in retreat, leaving behind the dead, fallen horses, and fires slowly dying in the wind. The battle had ended not in triumph, but in bone-deep exhaustion. Clara stood in the middle of the battlefield, her bow still in her hands, with no target left to face. She felt no exhilaration, only the unmistakable knowledge that she was still alive. Amid the wreckage, she saw her father badly wounded, trapped beneath his horse. He looked at her with eyes that had once terrified her, now emptied of everything but bitterness. Clara knelt, not to apologize or to pray. She told him that her choice had been decided the day he bound her wrists and handed her over to the cold. Today was only the consequence. The dying man sneered, saying she would be abandoned again, that she had forgotten her place. Clara rose and looked toward the Apache camp people tending the wounded, calling each other's names, quietly grieving their losses. She turned her back on her father. No forgiveness, no hatred, only the truth. She had stopped apologizing for surviving. And this victory, if it could be called that, was simply the right to continue existing. As the sun set behind the jagged ridges, the Apache camp entered the stillness of morning. There were no cries of grief, only slow, solemn rituals. The fallen were wrapped in cloth, feathers placed in their hair, their names whispered into the wind as if to keep the last trace of them alive. Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from the release that comes after a storm. In the days that followed, she helped bury the dead, stack stones, and lay offerings. No one called her a hero. Taza told her that heroes die, but those who endure continue to live. He gave Clara a piece of hide etched with symbols and a black stone arrowhead, a sign of recognition, not by blood, but by what she had survived. Before the entire tribe, Clara was named as one of them, not because of lineage, but because the fire had failed to consume her. The declaration was quiet, yet heavy as an oath. On the final night, Clara sat on a hillside, watching the camp glow with firelight below. She could have left, but she chose to stay, not for revenge, and not to prove anything, only to keep living, in a world stitched together by scars and memory. Clara was no longer the girl who had been burned away. She was the one who had walked out of the fire, carrying her own story with her.